This week on the Discovering God podcast.
He doesn't ever say, yeah, you'll have your ease now. It's no, but keep in the midst of that, keep your eyes on me because I have overcome the world. Yeah. Not I'm getting you out of it. It's no, you're going to end up facing these things. The world is imperfect.
What it communicates to me about the nature of God is that suffering is inevitable in this world. The amount of brokenness that is in this world is inevitable. But if we can learn and experience God in it, then he's longing to be at our side in it. He redeems bad situations. He, builds out of brokenness.
Hey, welcome to another Discovering God podcast. My name's Rip Wahlberg.
I'm Jeff McLean.
All right, so Jeff, we are talking about understanding the importance of suffering,
which Christians never do.
It is honestly not a popular subject at all.
Yeah.
We want to talk about the goodies of God,
right?
But we really don't want to talk about the realities of life, that life not only has we want to talk about going from glory to ever increasing glory.
Yeah.
But we really don't want to talk about the valleys and the shadows right?
Yeah, for some reason we believe that if we can just name and claim prosperity, that God wants us to have life abundance, that we can actually remove ourselves out of suffering. In fact, this week, I was reading Chronicles. It's not normally where I go, and I wasn't even going to, I don't know why I decided to go with here now, but I was reading a story about a man named Jabez. Mm-hmm. And I would say that if there's one book that has really shaped the past 20 years and our understanding of suffering in a wrong way, it's this book,
okay,
The Prayer of Jabez. It's one verse in the Old Testament. Jabez cried out to the God of Israel, "Oh, would you bless me and enlarge my territory? Let your hand be with me and keep me from harm, so that I will be free from pain." And God granted his request. And a whole book came out about that, about how as long as our prayers are pure, God will take us out of our problem and our pain into his abundance, right? He's a God who owns many cattle in the fields and hills, and he'll pour out his goodness on you. And I'm going to tell you, I think that has shaped us in so many ways. But as I was reading it this week, we do an injustice when we don't read the verse before it.
Okay.
Jabez was more honorable than his brothers, so he's already a person of conviction and honor. And his mother named him Jabez because she said, "I gave birth to him in pain." Seemingly, his whole life was suffering and pain. He must have had a pretty rough childhood, but because even despite of that pain, and she's carrying some sort of pain, he's still living honorably. God reverses often the hindrances that we have that bring shame or guilt or powerlessness in our lives. And I think that's what's happening here. It's not a gift of prosperity, but we don't need to get into that. But I'm just saying, I think that things like this over the years have given us the idea that Christians don't need to suffer, or they suffer needlessly.
I'll give you another example that sets this up. I have heard it, I've seen it more times than I can even count, that we pray a prayer, a blessing over someone by saying, "Give him a double portion, Lord." And so we're praying the older brother prayer, basically, on a person.
Yeah.
And I want to, it makes sense in our day, but that's all it makes sense in. Mm-hmm. Because it's not even good interpretation. That is to act, if we're to say how that applies in the understanding, that is actually to be not praying, we're trying to pray, give him double all the goodies. Yeah. But what the prayer would actually do if God did it.
And then in our circles we say, "More, Lord,
more." Lord, yeah. But if God actually did that, according to the biblical understanding, it would be that he'd be giving the person twice the responsibility.
Which doesn't come with twice the abundance.
And it doesn't come with twice the ease and comfort either.
Right.
It would come with
more responsibility, more pain.
Yes. So I just find that, we're very disconnected, I would say, honestly, from the Bible, and we're very lopsided, let's say. in what we want to hear and versus what we're willing to hear of God's word.
I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and he said to me some things about his life, and I could tell he was dancing around something really big. He's about to face a very serious health as well as financial situation, housing situation. And I said to him, what about that?
Mm-hmm.
How are you feeling about that? And he said, Jeff, we're not putting doubt out in the air.
Mm.
He said, I have believed that God is going to carry me, and I'm not going to explore the what if he doesn't, because I have faith that what God's going to do is come through in us and me. I said, I hear that. That's great. Just do me one thing. Look at the life of Jesus and show me how Jesus lived absent of suffering and avoiding suffering, and then I'll hear your point.
Oh, but Jeff, but at the same time, Jesus said, if you have faith and not doubt, then you can tell this mountain to go be tossed into the sea. So,
and the context of that, right? Meanwhile, though, Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me.
Yeah.
No one has greater love for their friends than the one that lays it down. Jesus himself lives a life. He says, foxes have holes to go home, but I don't even have a pillow.
I don't even have a pillow.
Yeah.
I don't even have a house. I don't have a pillow.
Yeah.
Right.
And so we cherry pick what we want out of Jesus' teachings, out of the scriptures as a whole, such as Jeremiah 29:11.
Oh, and by the way, in this world, you will have tribulations, many sorrows, many struggles, and so forth.
Yeah.
He doesn't ever say, yeah, you'll have your ease now. It's no, but keep in the midst of that, keep your eyes on me because I have overcome the world. Yeah. Not I'm getting you out of it. It's no, you're going to end up facing these things. The world is imperfect.
I think we as followers of Jesus do another thing that's an injustice to the topic of suffering. So first is we act like it's not there. And then there's other people that act like it's all around us. We're being persecuted all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't tell you how many times a week that I hear someone tell me they're suffering in some way. And what they mean by that is they just didn't get their way. Yeah. The Rolling Stones sang one of the greatest songs of all time, I just can't get no satisfaction, right? And he's complaining about all of his situations that aren't working out, the way that things are triggering it up in him. And the reality is, just because we don't get satisfaction, we don't get our own way, doesn't mean we're suffering. That's not what it means to suffer. And so today we're going to look at some scriptures.
Okay.
I believe, right?
That
look at suffering and hopefully I'm going to say right size suffering in our life, but also give us a meaning of why suffering happens.
Yeah.
So where are we going first, Rip?
So first one is Psalm 119. Psalm 119:71. And it reads...
right in the middle of your Bible.
Right in the middle. 119:71 says, it is good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. And I don't, so many places, how do you even begin that? Not because it's not right, because it speaks so profoundly counter to what we're used to, what I've seen as of late, I've seen as of late in the church, what the popular teachings are in the church. It runs so counter to it. It was good. Doesn't say it was good that I experienced harm. It just, it was good that I was afflicted.
Yeah.
Afflicted is to be brought low.
Yeah.
It's to be bowed. So it has this idea of, just being brought low, that it's bent over under the weight of pressure. And so they come up with a word that describes the picture, is really how they're speaking in Hebrew.
Yeah. And we live in a time where we say suffering is a sign that you're doing something wrong, or suffering is because you don't have enough faith, or you're not living into God's best. But here is David saying, I'm grateful that I'm suffering. If you would back up, you'd see what he's suffering. He's suffering. Really, people are smearing him with lies, even though he's tried to live a good life. It seems like the bottom continues to fall out. And I don't know about you, but I can relate to that. Man, I'm trying to live with integrity here, and I'm watching other people around me succeed, it seems, who aren't, right? And that's not always the case, but it feels like that.
Yeah. The interesting thing is that the implication here too is that if you take it as I was bowed low, that some of this is by the hand of God.
Yep.
Like David recognizes. So what I'm pointing out is that he sees in the suffering, he sees the hand of God, but he's not shaking his fist at God as if how dare you. He's actually saying, your plans for me were good because this has a corrective nature in it.
So I don't want to go down the rabbit trail, but you would say you think God has sent the suffering in some way?
Well, I would say I don't know that it's as explicit right here.
Yeah.
Like he's not saying you afflicted me, and he's not saying certain things that place it at God's feet, but the nature of is that God is like the things in life like that, God uses them in corrective ways, and God will often, when necessary, if we're not learning what we would need to for our benefit, he will discipline with hardship and difficulty.
Yeah.
But it's always with correctiveness in mind, but from God.
Yeah, I think, and this would be a fun debate sometime, I tend to think of, there's a bit of a protective nature. I mean, there's just stuff that happens in life because it's life and life is hard and there's suffering. I tend to think of there's a protective nature around us, and when we live outside of God's best, we become more vulnerable. So like in a statement like this, I don't see God as the sender of the affliction, but he's a utilizer of the affliction. In which case, we get imagery of Job, right? There's the reality that even in our suffering, there's something to be learned. The word for afflicted are ono, right? It's that forced out of weight and embarrassment. You're at the end of yourself to be bowed down. And I think there's two ways that we can get a real view of life, or an accurate view of ourselves. And one of those is when God does something otherworldly, supernatural, and we get a 30,000-foot view of life. A lot of the prophets in the Old Testament, they get that. And I was up on a mountain, and I'm looking down, and this is kind of what I see. And then we also get a real view of ourselves when life is stripped away from us in some way, in suffering, when we're when we're forced to be bowed down. And so here, what I see happening is God utilizing the affliction to just realize that here at the end of himself, he's realizing what he's learned in his suffering, in which case we shouldn't run from suffering. We shouldn't be like, oh, God doesn't want ever for me to suffer, because it's in our suffering we learn the most.
Right. Because this is why I say that there's this God's in it to some kind of degree.
Right.
And I may be wrong here, but if you look at Psalm 119, a couple verses earlier, 67, it says, it says, before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word. So I think because he says, now I keep your word, there's a correctiveness in the affliction, right? So our pride would make us go do things our own way. But then the struggle, what we reap out of that, let's say, is the correction. It's the affliction. And he says, now I keep your word. So at times there's that discipline of God where God may send something, or it's the direct result of the consequence of our own actions that God will not protect us from in order that we learn.
Yeah.
And so I find that in God's nature, whether he, as you said, sends it or allows it, I think from time to time it could be either or, circumstantially. But I would prefer to look at the nature of God's character, in that what he's trying to produce in us is for our benefit.
Yeah.
And the psalmist then says, yeah, before I got humbled, I went and did my own thing.
Yeah.
But it was good that smashing these two verses together. It was good that I experienced that
because brought about this.
Because now I keep your word.
Mm-hmm.
I keep your statutes and commands. So suffering has a way of correcting us. It causes us to reflect. It causes us to consider our own ways, which I think is entirely necessary because we're the ones with the problem.
And that's what, I mean, he says, I went astray, right? Mm-hmm. So in our suffering, we realize the ways that we've lived outside of God's best, God's favor, the presence of God, right? Ironically, right before that, he says, the whole earth's filled with your love, teach me your degrees. But he still finds a way to get outside of not God's love, but God's presence or his best, his favor. Even though he's experienced the goodness of God, he's still willing to walk away. And the truth is, we experience suffering, and it's in our suffering that we realize the places that need pruned in our lives. Right? The John 15 passage, it's in suffering we realize what isn't bearing fruit in our lives.
Yeah, it's also one of the ways in which people in general come to faith in Jesus. Yeah. I liked this quote in a book I'm reading, The Critical Journey. I love that
book. When I saw you put it, I read this in my first master's. I love this book.
Oh, it's a good book. The Critical Journey by Hagberg and Bulick.
Looks at our spiritual formation journey
over a 6-stage progression.
Right. Yeah.
Most people kind of work between stages 1 and maybe 3. The real formative and get to the good stuff happens.
The wisdom stages, yeah.
And the live from love and rest kind of stuff happens later.
Yeah.
But he says this: people enter into a relationship with God in one of two very different ways. Some come through a sense of awe, which we've talked about, encounter, and others out of a sense of need. And so what I'm connecting there is that I see this as a connection point because if I'm afflicted, I'm probably going to be finding myself in a place of need.
Yeah.
Right? And so for my own selfish reasons, I might be coming to God so that he could fix it, or because I think maybe he can fix it. Yeah. And that might be self-seeking, but I'm still at least coming, depending on the time of life and that, quote, suffering that I'm enduring, I may decide to turn to God as the only option I've got.
Yeah. There was another quote that reminded me of. There's another quote in a book. I don't know if you've read this one. It's called Tug of War, The Downward Ascent of Power by Wilmer I forget how to pronounce his last name, Villacorta. And in the book that I read from him, The Tug of War, he says, Jesus's own nature was suffering filled. It modeled vulnerability. In other words, he didn't say, I'm above this or out of this, right? And Jesus invites us to share in his sufferings and to deal in our sufferings with our frenzied efforts towards temporary success and align our lives with the transformative power of vulnerability. And so this is what I wanted to say, how I think this relates, is that, yes, in suffering, as you're talking about, or in relationship with God, we get this sense of awe, this sense of need, but we also get the transformative power of vulnerability when we reach the end of ourselves, when we're worn down. I love that image a couple weeks ago that we had Chris on, and he talked about the pebble on his desk where the edges got rubbed down in discipleship. Well, I think suffering does the same thing. I mean, water is pressure, right? Water has a destructive nature. It can reshape coastlines and cities. I think of barrier islands along the East Coast, like Assateague Island. Every storm reshapes it in some way. Suffering reshapes us in some way, especially if we understand what Wilmer is saying here about the transformative power of vulnerability. And that is, I'm not above this, I'm in this, and what am I going to learn from it? How am I going to be vulnerable to Jesus and what he wants to do in this space?
Yeah, that's really important. I think it's good.
All right, you have another passage in which we're going to look at.
All right, so Ecclesiastes 3:4.
Yeah.
Ecclesiastes says, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. And so the context is the beginning of this poetry. It's Hebrew poetry.
Yeah.
And so the beginning of it is there is a time for everything under the sun.
Yep. Everything has its purpose.
And so he lists these things, and in verse 4, like there's, time for good stuff and this and that. But in verse 4, he says this: a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. And it's really beautiful because he's using polar opposites, and it's like in the written form, they're a counterbalance to one another.
Yeah.
And
you can't have one without the other.
You can't have one without the other. And that there's a time, neither one exists without the end of itself, and there will be a time of something of the opposite for a time. Like we had it felt like we took years, you saw it, like it took many years to come out of the tragedy of losing Aiden, right? And then we had this, it felt like a reprieve where we had like, life just felt good. It had a breath of fresh air. And there was just a lot of upbeat things. And kind of out of nowhere, our legs kind of got taken out of us again. And yep. We entered a season again as like a difficult time. Many things transitioned for us. And it's like, wow, so it's counterbalance. Like you have good and you have bad. Paul said the same thing, right? He had both good times and bad times in his life and in his ministry.
We get an image almost of a seesaw, right? Sometimes you're down here and the good stuff feels up and out of reach. And sometimes it flips and it's the other way and you're looking back down at the pain like, oh, I remember that. And every once in a while, it'll balance just for a second to give you a taste of what heaven is going to be like. Yeah. And then some big kid comes around and sits on the other side of the seesaw and flips it back up. And I think we spend more time down in those spaces, and rightfully so. I mean, even in Jesus' ministry, I love the story of when Jesus is up on the mountain and he's praying. And we looked at this story last week. And, he says to Peter, who do you say I am? You're the Christ. You're the anointed one. All right, don't tell the other guys yet. I need them to figure it out for themselves. And they're going down the mountain, and Peter just unloads all of his expectations on Jesus. And Jesus says, Peter, we're just up there, man. Get behind me. They get down there. They run to the rest of the disciples who are trying to drive a demon out of a boy. They can't do it. And really, they spent very little time on top of the mountain in the beautiful spot where there was this holy moment where all is clear. Peter has this confession, but they spend the rest of their ministry pretty much in the valley, in a place where there's suffering. And they have to hold on to those mountaintop experiences. So much when we look at suffering, it's how do I get out of it? And how do I get back to the mountaintop?
Right.
And I think that's the wrong motive. I think it's how do I hold on to what I experienced in the mountaintop? Realizing there's a season for that. And it's short. It will come again. The seesaw flips, but man, I don't need to rush out of there. J. Robert Clinton, in his leadership emergence theory, talks about how we as leaders go in boundary seasons when we let go of a defining piece of ministry and then we're getting ready for another one. That we try to rush out of that space right there. He calls it the boundary season, and we try to rush out of it before we're ready. And I think the same is true of our suffering. We look at it; it's uncomfortable, it stings. It smells like death. It tastes like death. It looks like death. And so we say, got to get out of here. And really, if we own that there's a season for it, we got to embrace it. I hate winter, but I have to embrace winter. I can't get away from it. You know what I mean? It's important.
One of the things I think that suffering teaches us is that it actually is the time that teaches us.
Yeah.
It's the time of life. We really don't learn from the good times. We just sort of enjoy the good times.
Yeah.
Right? And we're probably
life
not
is a highway, right?
Yeah.
We're just
and it's in the hardship seasons that we actually learn and grow. If we're willing to basically press into them and face them, rather than sort of have to, like you said, get out of them fast or figure out how to just navigate it, but not learn through it and not grow from it. Because I think you can otherwise endure hardship without making it productive.
Yeah.
And it's the it's the hard times that actually teach us the most.
Mm. And then maybe the opposite is true. There was a book I read by Matthew Kelly. It's called Life is Messy. And he says, comfort reduces our ability to hear truth and align our lives with it. So if suffering is a place where we hear God the most, we experience God the most, we grow the most, then we need to realize that the opposite end of that is comfort actually numbs us in some way, whereas he says it reduces our ability to align our truth. So yeah, I agree with you. In the comfort, the place we want to get to, we actually produce very little fruit. In pruning things, growth comes from pruning, right? I mean, every year if you have roses or fruit trees, you need to cut them back to the point where they look scary, like they're dead. And the next year, but bam, right, they're back in fruit. And it's not then that they're growing. They're growing when you've pruned them back.
Yeah. It's an upside down kingdom.
Yeah.
And it's a counterintuitive thing that is but it is, I think, is undeniably true. And if we resist it, we basically will be, what would I say about, we're not going to mature.
Yeah.
Whether it's psychologically or spiritually, we're really not going to mature if we live simply to avoid hardship and pain.
Yeah.
We don't need to seek it. We don't need to love it.
Or think we're in it when we're not. But I think there's something to embracing. Like, I don't get to move past the shadowy parts of my history till I embrace them and realize, yeah, that was me. I did those things. And I think the truth is suffering. Do we embrace it instead of fighting it? We're not going to get out of it. People drowned and people in rescue moments because they often suffer. You know what I mean? They try to fight. Like, let's just let the suffering moment embrace us in some way. Pete Grigg, he writes a book called God on Mute. And he says that it's through suffering that we experience illumination, both in us and through us. That can only come through suffering. A healing that we can only minister or experience when we have ourselves been wounded, right? We experience a sense of illumination in us when we embrace our suffering, when we realize that it's only going to come through suffering. And I love that idea. And I'm trying to train myself that because I'm kicking and screaming to get out of suffering. There's some situations in my life right now where I just feel like I'm losing who I am. I feel underutilized, but I spend a lot of time then trying to get into a place where I feel better utilized or where I'm seen or valued more. And I end up losing the present.
Yeah.
By kicking and screaming, I lose the present. And I'm really working hard on it. And it's hard.
Yeah. For me, I feel like I can relate in that not being formally in ministry at the moment, it doesn't feel like suffering.
Yeah.
But it's also not fun. Like to be in that in between where you're not productive. You don't have the same thing to kind of pour yourself into. Yeah. And so instead, to learn to sit in that space that's very uncomfortable and to just, Lord, how do I keep my eyes on you? And Lord, what's for me to be learning right now? And what I'm finding is it's a time of transforming. Like I'm kind of starting to think I'm probably not going to come out of this the same person that I went into this.
Yeah. Or better, like I want to be.
Well, hope the hope is better, but you have to be willing to do the work, and you have to be willing to do heavy lifting and intense introspection.
And you may look different. You may have some scars. Yeah,
Gonna have. Well, the scars are what I'm trying to work on at the moment. Yeah. But it's really interesting that in the places that where it doesn't have to be blatant suffering, but it still is discomfort versus comfort. Comfort might be like where we're getting all the accolades and adulations
I
and
hear that.
getting to travel for and invited to this
You're
and
on
that,
the circuit.
or otherwise you're on the sideline and just kind of watching it all happen for others. So to speak, right? Like,
Yeah.
And
Feeling count out.
are we willing to go in and like, okay, Lord, what do I need to be learning right now?
Yeah.
And not, I'm speaking of myself, not of you for your situation.
Trust me, you're speaking to my situation.
But I think those are the ways that we would best approach these times. In addition, I think, Lord, how do I keep my eyes on you?
Yeah.
So that it's productive and I don't just kind of walk around in despair or depression.
I don't have any answers for this other than that I know I'm trying to get more present in my suffering and growth. Mm-hmm. And Henry Nouwen says, prayer, the discipline of prayer is the discipline of the present, of the moment. And he says it's through prayer that we recenter our lives at God and what he's doing. And that's all I can do in this season. And I would say suffering, stop trying to get out of it. Mm-hmm. Prayer is the discipline of the present. Allow yourself to be orchestrated. It's when we, I think, grasp the responsibility and what God wants us to learn, we get to emerge out of it. But because we spend so much time avoiding it, we don't actually fully learn what's there.
Yeah. So what do we say to let's start with the Christian. What do we say to the Christian who their perspective is, I really just only want to encounter the good stuff?
Yeah. I would say you're going to be, man, I just read a book about this. I wish I could remember what the quote was, but you're really going to be a lopsided Christian. I mean, there's a reality that you're missing out on something God has designed us to experience. And it's also kind of shallow. I mean, you're only going to experience, what Paul calls the milk. You're going to remain an infant. If you want to stay in the shallowness of God, I understand that, but you're actually going to, and I think what you want to do is experience God. You're going to actually miss out on experiencing him in some way. If I only experience my dad on the weekends growing up, I don't have a good example of my dad and who he was. You know what I mean? We have to experience all the Father. What would you say?
I think I would say, what I would want to say is, well, get ready to be disappointed. That seems kind of harsh and blatant. But I don't think you can, that's not the reality of life. And I don't even think the Bible speaks of that as a reality and an option. So I think it's a rather incomplete. And I think too that we can't just rely on, well, I'll know God by experiences. I think we need we will come to know God also, and sometimes in deeper ways by walking into the unavoidable difficulties and meeting God in the middle of it. And we'll learn and grow more. We'll learn about him and grow more in ourselves if we do that. But if all we do is try to avoid it with some facade and mirage, like you said, I don't think we're going to grow.
I found the quote. It's in a book called The Five. It's called Build. What's the book called? Anyway, it's called Build a Better Life by Brandon Schaefer. And he says, our observation is that some love to linger in the blessing, and some pioneer leaders love to constantly pursue breakthrough. And he describes breakthrough as that hard place, right? But if we only focus on blessing without breakthrough, we find ourselves merely indulging in the goodness of God. And then that indulgence, which is not a good thing, we find ourselves missing out on the things that he wants to expand in our lives. He says, but then if we're all about the breakthrough, the hardships with no blessing, we find ourselves burned out. And our lives will be defined by striving and constant work with no rest.
Yeah.
And I just love that imagery, right? And that's what I think I would share with them. Like, both of you, if you're stuck here or there, you're missing out by thinking this is it.
And So finally, too, what does this say about the nature of God to the person who thinks that they aren't really interested, or who's just sort of far from God?
Yeah.
Maybe disinterested.
What does suffering say about the nature of God?
Yeah.
I would say that what it communicates to me about the nature of God is that suffering is inevitable in this world. The amount of brokenness that is in this world is inevitable. But if we can learn and experience God in it, then he's longing to be at our side in it. He redeems bad situations. He, builds out of brokenness. And so I think what I would say is that there's a goodness there that, he's not going to remove us from the problems we get ourselves in free will. But the reality is he's going to be there with us. And he's going to be there, as we saw a couple of weeks ago when I quoted that Isaiah passage. He's going to be holding our right hand and saying, "Don't fear, right? I'm here with you." What would you say?
I think I would say that it reveals that God can use those difficulties, and he's not out to harm us for his giggles, right? He's actually out to help benefit. His intention is to have our benefit in mind. But he also loves us enough to not protect us from the learning and difficulty. And so he's got a long-term but not malicious and malevolent intention for us. And it's incumbent on us to also want to step up to that line and meet him there, let's say. So again, I'm just trying to sometimes point out the God that we see in the Bible is often different from the God we hear people shaking their fist at.
Because we've seen the God you shaking your fist at, and we're like, some of that's worthy of shaking your fist at, right?
It's understandable, but it doesn't mean that God's the cause.
I'm just constantly reminded of John 15 as we talk about it. And as we talk about this, he says, if you remain in me, you're going to bear much fruit. But he also says that you're not going to bear fruit if you remain on yourself. And he says that there's a reality that pruning needs to happen. He says he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. And the truth is that suffering is that act in us. It's what takes off the dead branches, the dead weight, the things we believe about God, or the things that we think equate to be a Christian life that keep us from truly experiencing who God is. And suffering allows us to experience that pruning.
So that's really good, and I think it's helpful. I hope it's been helpful for you. And we hope that just in where you're at today, that even if you're in the midst of hard times, that you'll still be encountering and experiencing God. So thanks for joining us. And as you stay in God's word, we hope you'll come face to face with God by coming face to face with his word. We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Discovering God podcast. And if you did, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. And you can find us on all the social media platforms under Discovering God. Just look for the compass.